Hello and welcome back to the Info Diet podcast. My name is Michael Guimarin. Today I'm joined by Josh Steinman, founder of Galvanic and former member of the National Security Council during the Trump administration. Josh, it's really great to have you here today.
Hey, Michael, great to be here.
Awesome. Well, these are, like I mentioned, these are pretty free flowing. And where I'd like to start is you have a tremendous amount of experience and Galvanic itself is in the cybersecurity industry. And I think it would be interesting for folks to hear just a little bit about your thoughts on the information environment, how it interacts with, civilians' use of the internet, or sort of any topic that you want to go to. And then I can sort of steer the conversation from there, if that works.
Yeah, happy to. So
maybe start with what you're doing and sort of why you're doing it and why it's important, or something like that.
Yeah. So I was in charge of all technology policy for the United States government while serving as the senior director for cyber on the National Security Council for 4 years under President Trump. That was 2017 to 2021. So national strategies, executive orders, other special scenarios, incident response, all that stuff rolled up to me. So I was the person that got the phone call at 2 a.m. when strange things were happening on the internet, asking, do we need to wake up the president? Before that, I'd been in Silicon Valley, and before that, I'd been in the military. And in all of those jobs and all of those worlds, I've been very involved in thinking about how you create strategic success. I know that sounds a bit strange, but when you're working in a startup, like, you have to think it through, like, the multiple steps required in order to succeed. When you're in the military and you're in, a conflict zone, you have to think about, like, what are the things necessary for us to win over the will of the people. And so I've been sort of sitting in this space, if you could call it that, for many years, for over 10 years. Obviously, now that I'm back in entrepreneurial world, I've started a tech company that's a cybersecurity company. I think about it in terms of how my startup is going to do well, and so yeah, that's sort of like a very basic overview of who I am and what I'm doing. I think for your viewers specifically, the thing that I think about a lot is that information is becoming something more palpable than we have experienced as a species for our entire history. What do I mean by that? I mean that information is becoming a technology. And so if you think about technologies, and there's a class of technologies we can call as, like, soft technologies. A soft technology is like language, money, electricity. It's a thing that allows you to move stuff in a very low friction way. And so we are creating right now, and have been for the past 100 years, a soft technology layer of information in the world. What do we mean by that? It means that most people are watching this on a cell phone, and you think, oh, it's a cell phone, it's a computer, it's connected to the internet, and that's all true. But the cell phone is also a whole bunch of other stuff. So, for example, a Google address, a Gmail address that's logged in, that's tracking where you are in the world, that's offering you up advertisements based on your location, that's servicing you imagery based on things that you've done. Essentially, you can imagine that there's like a layer in the world, like a new dimension of the world that's composed of information. And that information is and can be like relative to each location, each person, each physical object. This is how you can imagine a network of self-driving cars operates, right? It used to be that there was a physical object called a car. Human beings made it on a production line. It rolled off the production line. It went to a dealership. Someone went and bought it. It was a physical object of steel, petrochemicals, maybe some small, radio or electronics or something. Now we have all that plus a computer, plus the internet, which means that car is a real physical object, and it's also a digital object that exists in physical space with an information signature and any number of other second, third, and fourth order implications thereof. Why does it matter? It matters because it's going to have the same transformative effect that the creation of real globalized money had. It's a very strange thing to say, I think. But money allows effort, time, force to be transmitted over very long distances. Information does the same thing, especially when it's connected to the internet. And so what I try and explain to people, and this is very abstract, there's like a whole bunch of books that I've recommended to people as they want to think about this, but you have to imagine information as not only something that you're consuming, but something that exists in the ambient environment that can be observed, but also manipulated. A very small portion of this information we call news, right? Tweets, etc. But tweets aren't just the explicit text, right? There's imagery in tweets with geolocations, there's timestamps, there's all this other information that's attached to even basic things that we would think, oh, it's just a tweet. It's not. So it's like, imagine if you could put on a pair of augmented reality glasses and actually see all the information in the environment. See your, thermostat broadcasting full audio back to its headquarters company. See it broadcasting, the last 24 hours of temperatures that it was controlling. See your car broadcasting data back to some, server farm in the middle of the country, etc. The information exists all around us, and we're only exposed to a very small portion of it, but the vast majority of it is used to shape perception, control commercial relationships, and do any number of other things that are almost mysterious to the human mind.
So extending that metaphor, would you say that so basically we have physical devices, they've now been digitized or in the process of, and now they are basically like, this is maybe not the best metaphor, but we're basically in a rowboat or a boat on the ocean, and there's a bunch of icebergs, and sort of we only see the top of the iceberg, which is the consumer appliance aspect of the technology that we're using. But everything underneath the surface of that iceberg, all of the metadata and all of the abilities for there to be locomotion or whatever are there, and that we're not necessarily perceiving them. And so there's an entire class of new capabilities that we're going to have to contend with in the information environment. Does that sort of track? Or
yeah, these types of metaphors are all useful in some kind of a way, right? So that's a useful metaphor. There are other useful metaphors. The reality is that we live in an environment where there's very deep information about many things that are happening. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think that we've really started to contend. I'm not sure we ever will actually contend with it. I think that it's sort of like something that very few people can even grasp.
It's kind of
and
like
some of them, yeah,
it's kind of like viruses on our PCs, and then some people made antivirus software, and then eventually we got to different classes of applications so that the viruses went away. What you're basically saying is like a war in Yemen has the potential to affect my self-driving car in the United States because my self-driving car is connected to the internet and is therefore available to anyone to access the APIs if they have the capability, and that the universe of possibilities for just that particular object, let alone my thermostat being used to hack into my bank or whatever, is so vast that we're not going to perceive it. And so there will be a class of people like you who create antiviral software to sort of keep us one step ahead of, our devices' total anarchy. Is that sort of where you're getting at?
yeah, in that direction is right. I think what I'm trying to say is we think we live in a world that is very similar to the world of 50 years ago, which was an industrial world. And what I'm saying is the world has actually radically transformed over the past 50, 40, 30, 20 years of informationalization. And I don't think that I don't think most people have deeply internalized just how much the environment, I mean that as in the total space of occupied humanity, like the space we live in has really been transformed by information.
Totally.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is something I noticed about 10 years ago. And in my very academic background, I called it like computer literacy or computeracy, and that there were a set of primitives that you could build anything on top of that were just fundamentally different from what came before in literacy and numeracy, right? So out of literacy and numeracy, we get industrial processes. And sort of like the classic example is I have the DMV, there are 10 tellers, there are 100 people who are wanting to do things. And so they all line up 10 people per line. If I want the average line time to go down, I need to open up new windows, right? It's a linear relationship between the number of tellers and the ability to get work done, right? So I might hire an extra 10 people, and then there's overhead capacity on that, right? So now all the lines are 5 people long. But with the internet and with the computer, we're not talking about creating an exponential leverage in the sense that we now, can easily add more or fewer tellers. What we're talking about is digitizing all of the jobs that the teller did, so there is no line, right? So 100 people can be served simultaneously. And the idea of just that kind of exponential inputs to outputs, and then as a vector through time, is, I even tried to talk to people in Washington about it. Like, nobody gets it, right? Or the idea of how do you build a recursive government, right? So like in the, I'm sure you could tell me way better than me, but that we have a lot of policies where it's like, okay, every year we're going to collect a bunch of data, we're going to see where we are against our metrics, and then we're going to adjust course, sort of in the best case, right? And in certain instances,
the Federal Reserve is a really well observed example of this. They take snapshots of data over discrete periods of time measured in weeks, and all that data is available live, nearly live.
Right. But that's like a level one. Like, what does it look like to redesign the Federal Reserve's process with like a while loop as an example, as opposed to doing this kind of sort of, it's kind of like released software versus CI/CD, right?
Yeah, maybe the first thing that we should do is take away the thing that exists and then figure out if we want to rebuild it.
Yeah, but how do you do that, Josh? I mean, I can see that we are heading towards some kind of critical cascade point, right? Yeah. But we can't just blow up the whole thing and just be like, all right, well,
we can't just end the Fed.
Maybe it will happen, right? because it will take too long, or they'll be so out of whack. The level of weirdness is so high, right? Like my dad always used to tell me, it's very difficult to globally administer something that's locally delivered. And he used the example of healthcare, and that even like people in their 20s versus people in their 80s have different priorities on healthcare. And so it's very difficult to come up with a global standard. With the Federal Reserve, now that the US has so much power in the dollar zone, it just doesn't make sense that there's a single interest rate policy for the entire world, right? And so like it's clear that certain sectors need, sector specific industries, and sort of where that thought gets you, that thought experiment, is that every person who's participating will have their own functionally like central bank, right? Like that's the end state of crypto. But it's like, how long does it take us to get there? 100 years? I don't know.
I'm not sure you ever get there.
So what are people supposed to do? All right. Let's turn to the, okay. So the world is vastly weirder than we anticipate. We've shifted from an industrial first society, right? So the modality of people making money, which is what's driving the market, has shifted from industrial process to information process. We don't understand it. And one of the things that people watching this podcast experience, and I'm sure you've experienced it more than most, is that because the internet has reduced the cost of distributing information to free, or basically free, the value of secrets has gone down. And so the shelling point for actors in the space is not necessarily to spend more and more money on keeping better secrets, but to flood the zone, if you will, with disinformation or misinformation, whose outcome that they're driving forward is to disrupt the decision-making process. So it's not that, the secrets aren't out there. It's that we're going to put out a bunch of junk information to confuse our adversary so they can't make decisions. Their OODA loop is disrupted fundamentally, right? And like, we saw this multiple times, and during the Trump administration, their entire media strategy, keeping the media off guard by doing something different every, 2 days or whatever, was incredible, right? But as a citizen, I'm now part of that, and I'm participating in that, and I'm consuming that information. What if any hope do we have to navigate that misinformation? And like, have you come up with any sort of heuristics or rules that you use to, help you identify? You just sort of be like, yeah, I don't read anything from this publication, right? Which is not really abstractable, but
yeah, I've pretty much stopped reading things. I read books now. The older, the better.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you see that as a pattern among your peers, where people are sort of exiting the information space because it's not possible to have a clear understanding of what's happening? Or are you seeing a bifurcation where some people are going deeper into it and some people are, like you, who are exiting?
At the very high end, I know a lot of people that are doing it. And then obviously there are other folks that, and I'm, to say that I've exited the information environment is disingenuous, because obviously I'm, depending on the week or the month, sometimes active on Twitter.
Yeah.
And so I'm certainly there. But in terms of consumption of information, vice broadcast, I've mostly exited the information consumption environment. Like, I see some stuff on Twitter. People send me articles, but my focus is on building a company, and not on the sort of chemical feedback loop of outrage that most media companies seek to ride for clicks and ad dollars.
Right. Well, I think this is the right strategy for everybody, right? Which is basically identify what you want to focus on that thing, and cut everything else out.
Yeah, there's a line that apocryphal Silicon Valley quote, who knows who said it first? Do you apply pressure or do you receive pressure? So for me, I prefer to apply information pressure, vice receive information pressure, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you're saying that you broadcast information from yourself. So you're generative, you're creating information as opposed to consuming it. Is that sort of how that trickles down?
Yeah. Yeah. Like making fun of stupid things that people are doing in the national security space. Occasionally I'll make light of the mids. and then talk about securing industrial systems, talk about history, talk about other things that interest me. But it's tough tough environment to be an information consumer, I think.
Yeah, totally. Cool. Well, we're running up against time in a few minutes here, so I guess questions that I might have are: what do you think that our information environment evolves into? Do you think that basically people like yourself who exit to an extent or switch over to generation and don't consume as much are going to become more?
I've been thinking a lot about this, and actually I was having a conversation about this with someone yesterday. For those of your readers who have seen or read Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, I think that, and Jordan Hall has talked about this a lot. Like, the reason why there's no value in consuming information is because the priors of the people producing that information are not shared in many cases. So, like, if I believe that genetics and science tell us that there exist, two sexes in the world, of what use is my reading a New York Times article on these types of topics that doesn't acknowledge scientific fact, right? You could extrapolate that out to any number of topics. And I think, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, that the solution is similar to one that is described in that book, where people can self-organize into what are called phylums, scientific term, groups of folks that essentially form opt-in societies with their own moral structures, scientific principles, economies, etc. And that having a system like that actually does recreate the system of incentives to read, right? Because if you're reading within a community that recognizes core sets of, provable facts, I mean, maybe not provable facts as well. I'm sure that, someone living in the Chaz would have found a lot of value in, regurgitating like post-Marxist literary theory, where I find no value in that, and nor would I find any value in consuming information put forth by someone whose priors are sort of wrapped up in that world and many other worlds. But the point is that if you read Diamond Age, great book, highly recommend, you'll see described in that book a world where you have multiple, somewhat competing, somewhat overlapping, definitely intersecting, essentially micro civilizations that are allowed to compete, right? And they have interoperable justice systems and other things like that.
This is sort of like, this is sort of like in The Sovereign Individual. I think he talks about these spaces where Christianity and Islam and other religions were all in the same city, and you would just sort of pick which set of rules that you belong to for that day, right? Mm-hmm. Depending on which sort of justice of the peace, if you will, that you came across. Mm-hmm. There's sort of two things that come out for me from this sort of Diamond Age metaphor. The first one is that it seems like there would be an immediate Red Queen race. So you have these networks where the values are explicit on entry, right? They're codified with a DAO or they're codified with software code. So you know exactly what sort of the priors, if you will. I talk about it as like, we have to understand what A is and agree on that before we can talk about how do we go from A to B, right?
Simple, A is A.
Yeah, except that A is subject to a social truth and social truth is subject to all the human biases, right? And that's sort of the problem that we have. And so I immediately see the emergence of a Red Queen race. So like total war, which I think is what we're seeing on the internet right now between a bunch of mafias, right? So they're not particularly large groups. They're like 150 people at most, but they're able to command very large armies, if you will, of bots or people who are entrained or whatever into a specific belief system. So you see a Red Queen race. So like, I agree, like, okay, great, we'll get to some sort of steady state, but it took 300 years between, Martin Luther and the Treaty of Westphalia, right? So that's not super great, or 200 years. And then the second thing, which I think is sort of equally interesting for me, is, what, we'll get back to that. So what do you think? Like, do you think we're just going to have a total war Red Queen race on this with these networks?
I'm not even sure. Like, I understand the Red Queen illusion, right? You have to keep running faster and faster and faster just to stay in the same spot. I'm not sure that that's how I think this would play out. It very well could be, right? Like, I haven't really thought about. I mean, I just, it's so complex. The thing that I'm thinking about specifically is like, how do I do to my real environment what I've done to the information environment, my information environment? There are specific things that I assess to be true, and I wish to build my mind based on those assumptions. And so I read according to those assumptions. And when I want to test those assumptions, I go find something that tests those assumptions, and I can, run my own sort of mental scientific process or non-scientific process.
Right.
And so the question is, like, if I could, would I want to do the same thing to my human environment? And to some extent I already have, right? Like, I, shop locally, have a limited set of friends, patronize a limited set of physical locations that, to me sort of represent a certain degree of neutrality or positive value. So the question is, how do you create an environment that allows you to be productive with those types of systems? And that's sort of where my mind's at.
Yeah, it's kind of like you were mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, that all of these objects, if you will, have all this data associated with them. And in a sense, you're asking for or seeking some kind of augmented reality level so that you can see to what extent the physical things align with your sort of digital space, right? The values that you're digital. So like, for example, is there a business that is giving money to a political cause that you don't agree with? Okay, I'm not going to patronize that business.
Yeah, much rather not. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, it's very fair, right? And sort of the challenge, right, of the localist argument, I think, is that there are these really, really large gangs that are forming that are, across multiple cities, right? So they don't even know everybody that's in there. And what you're talking about is building sort of like a local community that taps out at 150 people. And it'll be interesting to see how you can sort of connect that archipelago of affiliated things, right? And what does it look like from a reputation standpoint?
There's a fun book called Damon by a guy named Daniel Suarez, and it's got a sequel as well. It's also very good. Again, explores this type of world, like what happens when you cross the physical environment with the digital environment. I'm not sure that it is limited to 150 people, or what's that law? What do they call it?
Called Dunbar's number.
Dunbar's number. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. I'm not sure that it is. And I think the whole point of designing a digital structure that allows people to build and interoperate, I think that is a tool that could be used to facilitate these types of larger networks.
Yeah.
Neither
and
here or there.
The comment I was going to make earlier, which I forgot, was about griefers, right? Which are people that are from a different tribe that come in, right? And they are hidden, and then they just try to disrupt your tribe. And sort of like, how do we begin to deal with that? Because I do see a lot of groups that try to break away on the internet and sort of reform what we used to have in terms of consensus-based decision making. as opposed to what seems to be happening with fully anonymized, decentralized protocols, which is a resonance-based decision making. So they have all these groups that try to reform, like you said, like they'll meet together in the real world, they'll have their own Signal chats or their own Slack, they'll have consensus-based decision making, but then they grow to a certain size where there are people that can come in and sort of execute the, CIA how to disrupt an organization handbook, and then they're sort of right back to square one. Like my wife sees this with her, mothers groups on Facebook, where then when they reach a certain size, they sort of blow up.
Yeah.
Just curious.
Yeah.
What was that?
I said it's tough.
Yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah. Glory of the American system, though. We've been able to manage it for so many years.
Yeah. And you're still 100% that this is going to be, this time is not different, that we're going to sort of basically be able to reset the room.
Who knows?
Okay. Trying to be positive. Anything else that we should cover, Josh?
No, I think we're good, Michael.
All right, cool. Well, thank you very much.
Right.
Appreciate you coming on.
Of course. Yeah. See you soon.